So thank you, everybody, for being here. This is the breakout session on association participation, just so make sure you are in the right room. So Tom Wagener and I are going to kind of do a little tag team presentation. But just to give you a little background on myself, I'm Margaret Donahoe. I work with the Minnesota Public Transit Association. I'm also executive director of the Minnesota Transportation Alliance, which is a kind of umbrella coalition organization that includes local governments, labor unions, contractors, consulting engineer firms, suppliers, transit systems, kind of the whole gamut of transportation. And we've been working on advocacy for the Public Transit Association for over 20 years. And prior to that, I worked for the Minnesota Senate as a staff person for the Transportation Committee. So I'm gonna let Tom introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Tom Wagener. I started out, well, I could give you my life story, but I went to school in Madison, loved it there, stayed there, taught. My education degree was in math education and for secondary math education. And, but I grew up in Eau Claire and I kind of missed it. And some things were going on with the family. So I decided to move back to Eau Claire in 1997. And I wanted to get out of teaching. I wanted to be more involved with my family. So I thought, well, there was an opportunity in the newspaper for a bus driver, part-time bus driver for the city of Eau Claire. So I applied, got that, and I've stayed with them ever since. Was a driver, became a scheduler, became a supervisor, and for the last 7 years been the transit manager there. So in the last 2 years been the chair of the WIPTA executive committee. So welcome, it's good to see you.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of run through this PowerPoint and Tom's gonna jump in when he wants to add some points from his perspective. So, oh, I wanted to get to the slideshow, actually. Oh, no. Oh, good. Okay. Technology is very nerve-wracking, I gotta tell you. Okay, so as I'm sure a lot of you know, there are lots and lots of associations. And just in the world of transportation, for example, I put down a list of a lot of the associations that we work with that are very involved in the area of transportation in Minnesota. And I'm sure there are sister organizations in Wisconsin. So you've got sort of the pavement groups. You got the Minnesota Asphalt Pavement Association, the Concrete Pavement Association, the Aggregate Ready Mix Association. Then you've got kind of the industry associations like the Associated General Contractors, the American Council of Engineering Companies of Minnesota, the Association of Women Contractors. I'm sure there are those same kind of organizations in Wisconsin. Then we have the Minnesota Public Transit Association. We have a big transit advocacy organization. It's mainly focused in the metro area called Move Minnesota. And they work to kind of get individual advocates and bus riders organized. There's also a Suburban Transit Association. Then we have kind of more in the engineering planning realm. You've got the American Public Works Association and Association of Civil Engineers, or the American Society of Civil Engineers that does their report card every year. You've got local government associations, obviously, the Association of Minnesota Counties, the League of Minnesota Cities, Metropolitan Intercounty Association, Metro Cities, rural counties. So all these groups, right? And why do they exist? Because they work. Because getting people organized and communicating with each other works to help each individual city, county, company, transit system to understand better what's going on, especially in the political realm, what their colleagues are doing, how they can learn from their colleagues, and probably most importantly, how by joining together, they can have a much larger and stronger voice for whatever they're interested in. So I always find it fascinating when I go to Washington, DC as well, to see all the big buildings for some of these associations on the national level. They own big buildings by the Capitol. So associations are everywhere. They're going to be around. And to some extent, they're a little bit in competition sometimes when it comes to an issue like transportation. As you can imagine, these groups don't always agree and they don't always get along depending on what's happening. So another reason to be concerned about having a strong transit association is because to some extent you are going to have to compete with some of these other interests in transportation, and you want to be as strong and as organized as possible. So I don't know if you want to.
And I know in Wisconsin, we have different, what we call affiliate members that we join with because our interests do overlap. And so we can unite our voices together in those situations. And it just, when you have this, and really the history of WIPTA, it's gone through many different stages. Previously it was WIRTA, and previously that was WATA. And you have different initials that always work, but the bottom line is really it started as just an informal way of, hey, let's get together, let's join our heads, and let's figure out how we can make sure that our voice is heard when decisions are being made in Madison and also in Washington. So that's kind of the background of how we get.
Yep. Okay. So again, a lot of what associations bring in terms of value is what we're doing today, right? You're learning from your colleagues, you're getting the latest updates, you have an opportunity to talk directly to each other, learn best practices, all those things that would, if you had to work in isolation, it would be a lot harder to do your jobs. So a lot of what we focus on are the events and the training, the bus rodeo, the transit conference, other events where we can bring folks together so you can talk to each other and you can learn from each other, and you can get the kind of training and information that is going to help you in your jobs every day. And without an association, it would be pretty hit and miss, I think, especially in the area of transit. Like, our Office of Transit tries to bring folks together to some extent, but it's not really consistent, and they don't always invite every transit system to a meeting that they're organizing. Whereas we are very inclusive. And also in Minnesota, our transit systems are separated between Greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities metro area. So you literally have the Metropolitan Council, as you heard this morning, dealing with transit in the 7-county metro area, and MnDOT dealing with transit in the rest of the state. So without an association to bring all those systems together, they would never talk to each other very much because they're literally kind of in different worlds from a state agency perspective.
And one of our challenges is because of the variety of different modes of transportation, different ways of providing service, rural versus urban, small urban versus larger urban, all those different things. It's hard to find an association that's going to be able to meet all their needs, and that's the challenge. And that's why we need participation from all those different groups, from the rural folks. In our association, we rely heavily on Madison and Milwaukee. We just do, because they have more resources, but more staff, and they're able to provide assistance. But then through the association, we get that connection. So it really works well.
Another big benefit of having a strong association is that associations can be independent. I don't know about you, but we've lived through a number of Republican administrations that were not big transit supporters. And so oftentimes it's really the association who becomes sort of the lone advocate in St. Paul to say, wait a minute, this budget is not big enough for transit. And sometimes we've advocated for tax increases that a certain administration didn't support. So while we were out saying, you know, this tax should be available to local governments for transit, or we want this tax increased for transit, the Department of Transportation and the Met Council could not support that. So we were in a position to be much more independent and really look at what's best for transit, not what's best for a certain administration or political party. And to be that consistent, independent, objective voice that's really just focused on what's in the best interest of transit.
And that's a very good point, because some people are concerned, well, WIPTA hires a lobbyist. So are we lobbying them? No, there's no individual system that we're trying to benefit. We're trying to, like Margaret said, benefit public transportation in the state as a whole. And so you need to have people that are able to go in and talk to the legislators and not say they're representing, you know, Madison Metro or Milwaukee, because they have their own lobbyists. They do need to exert that influence, but then there also needs to be a voice for the public transportation as a whole throughout the state, so that everybody can benefit and have access to the services they need, in which transportation is a key element of getting that access. So.
Yeah, and especially for really small systems, they don't have their own lobbyist. And exactly. So yeah, sometimes, you know, the association is the only voice they can turn to and bring up certain issues that may be affecting them that can be addressed through legislation. So one of those issues that I'm sure both states have dealt with, that we continue to struggle with, is just the visibility and the attention that transit gets. So especially in the world of transportation here, roads and bridges get a lot more attention. And I'm sure that's true in Wisconsin. Even passenger rail and bikes and pedestrians are starting to get a lot more attention. And transit kind of continues to be sort of that in the shadows kind of mode. So we hear a lot about, especially in greater Minnesota, how much people don't realize that transit even exists. We hear all the time, oh, there's no transit outside the Twin Cities. Even though there are like 30 systems, but that's the perception. There's also a lot of confusion about who can use these smaller systems. When people see the smaller buses driving around, they think, oh, I can't ride that. You have to have a disability or you have to be an elderly person to use that service. So that's a big problem. So a lot of what we also try to work with systems on is how can we communicate better? How can we develop messages about transit and how to use it, how it's available, how it's funded, and help systems get that message out there.
And one of the challenges, especially from the smaller rural areas, is getting access to their representatives. And the association can help in that way. I know that we set up Zoom meetings with representatives from every district that we could, where there was a transit system represented, whether it's a shared ride taxi system or if it's a small urban system or a larger urban system. But it's just surprising to know how some of these representatives aren't even aware that they're receiving funding, that there's funding that's critical in their district to make sure that smaller communities have access to service. And through the association and through our lobbyists, they are able to get that word out to them, you know, being down there in the state capitol and making sure they understand, because they know they're doing their job. They know where all our systems are and they know who represents those areas. So they make sure that when they come across those people, they get that same message out that, hey, you have a system in your county, in your district. You have a system that's offering that needs funding. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to provide for the needs of the communities that you represent.
Right. So some of the other political challenges that we've faced, at least in Minnesota, is kind of the battle with light rail transit and a lot of political opposition to light rail transit can often become just sort of general opposition to transit in general. And so that has been a big challenge as well, especially for transit in the metropolitan area, trying to get legislators to understand that this isn't just to build big, expensive train projects, that most of the bus service or most of the transit service continues to be provided through buses. But when they hear the word transit, a lot of times what people think about is light rail transit. And so again, we have to continually focus more on the bus system. One interesting phenomenon that we found with the Minnesota legislature is that while there are legislators who are adamantly opposed to light rail transit, they seem to be fine with bus rapid transit. So it's been an interesting place to find some common ground, I guess. But it's a little confusing as to why when you think about it. So again, we've been kind of one of those voices trying to help educate legislators about the fact that there are very few light rail transit lines, and there aren't even plans for very many more in the future, that transit will continue to be very heavily dependent on bus service. So the other thing that we work with our systems on is kind of what Tom was talking about, is trying to get them to communicate more with their own local legislators, and not just legislators, but also local elected officials. So county commissioners, city council people, you know, and that becomes a really important connection and relationship when it comes to coming up with a local match, which has been kind of a struggle sometimes, to get those people to understand how the funding works, that yes, there's a lot of state funding, there's federal funding, but you have to have that local match. And where does that come from? Is it coming from the local property tax? Is it coming from fares? Is it coming from a local sales tax? There are a lot of different options, but we have to have local elected officials who understand that and who understand why it's important, and to support those local dollars, because there's a lot of competition for those local dollars. And if they don't feel like this is enough of a priority, then they're not going to put the local money into it. And no matter how much state and federal money there is, it can literally sit there if systems aren't ready to expand, to spend more money, to have that local support to access the state and federal dollars. So let's see. Oh, and you know, as Tom was talking about, the other thing that associations do is really to bring advocates together with people making these decisions. We have a transportation day at the Capitol. We tend to make it a little broader, not just a transit day at the Capitol, but a transportation day at the Capitol. But we also work to make sure that is a good transit representation at that event. We also do a Washington fly-in, and MPTA has been able to, through funding from dues and events, to pay for people from smaller transit systems to go to Washington, DC, because a lot of systems, they don't have that money to fly out there, to stay at a hotel, all those expenses. But the association helps people do that. So that's another benefit, as well as just helping people navigate the political process. Some people get very intimidated at the idea of talking to lawmakers, members of Congress. They don't necessarily understand the process, the committee process, the floor sessions, all those kinds of things. So helping people understand the process, the people, how to talk to lawmakers. That's a lot of what we focus on with MPTA.
And I just want to echo that is an important part too of the association, the ability to be able to do those types of outreaches on the Capitol and to do the fly-in to Washington, DC. I know there are representatives in Wisconsin who will not even allow a meeting to be set up unless you're a member or somebody from your district is going to be there. And it's a perfect opportunity if we have a key member that we want to make sure they understand the transportation issues. We'll invite someone from that district that has a public transportation system, and maybe it's a rural one, and to join us on that so that we can get that meeting. And it really is. It's a matter of we know we're not naive. We know we're not going to influence anyone, but what we need to do is make sure they understand what's going on in your district. And this is what an association helps to get that message out, helps to unify that message. And so lawmakers, they see our faces. We give them our sheets, we get to that, but mainly we want to make sure they understand that the decisions they're making are going to affect people in their who they represent.
Right, that grassroots advocacy is a lot of what we do. And again, a lot of it is that it's this multiplying effect, right? So you have to be a loud voice if you want to get noticed in the political process. And, as Tom alluded to, associations, oftentimes we get to know each other because we can form sort of informal coalitions too. So as issues come up, let's say there's a comprehensive funding bill that includes funding for both roads and transit. The association can reach out to the contractors and, road interests and say, okay, for this particular piece of legislation, let's all work together. And usually it's the association staff and active members who wind up in meetings with those other associations and making sure that transit is not forgotten in that bigger funding package, and being able to coordinate with other groups so we have the same message. We're all working together instead of fighting and competing with each other. That's another really big benefit of associations.
And our recent experience with Wisconsin, the last budget, because there are individuals, elected officials that think that this money's coming from federal government. So much money came that, okay, Wisconsin doesn't need that much more. There certainly were. It was at one time, it looked like all of transit funding was going to get cut, and it's amazing, because and the association will reach out to the members to make sure you're talking to your elected officials, make sure they understand, what cuts from the state would mean to your system. but then also having somebody down there on the hill when the bills are being voted on and they're going through their renditions and changes and having somebody there that is able to make sure they hear that voice saying, this is what's going to happen. You know, you have the system in your district. This is what's going to happen if this goes through. You know, so although there was a severe cut to funding for Milwaukee and Madison in Wisconsin, it could have been even worse. It could have been more of a cut also because there was talks about that, and there could have been cuts across the board for the smaller urban systems like ours and the rural systems. And because that was all on the table. And so having an association be able to make sure that the elected officials are educated about what the impacts of those things might be it's just invaluable at times like that. I just think of what happened last year in Wisconsin, that it is just makes it all the more important for our association to have its members involved and to make sure that they're being represented.
And I also want to make the point that, you know, it's also a way for individual systems to have concerns brought up to the agencies too. So for those of you who were at the morning session with the agency updates, you'll notice that Tori Nill with the Office of Transit mentioned a few times things that were brought to them from MPTA. One of those was a request that the department help systems develop 5-year plans. That was our idea, our suggestion. It was not well received at first, but it was taken on, and we really appreciate that because it has made a really big difference in helping systems who are understaffed all the time to really think about what do we need and where are we going as a transit system. And that's often so hard to do when you're just struggling day to day to keep buses on the road. So thinking 5 years down the road, who has the time or the staff for that? So we were able to work with the department to hire consultants to do individual plans for each system where they had a chance to sit down and think, oh, you know, maybe we do need a new bus garage. We hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, you know, that makes sense. And how do we get that process started? Because that can be a long, daunting process. And maybe we should have a route here, or maybe we do need more buses or whatever it is. But it was the association that really made that happen. And the department learned a lot out of that too, about the needs for of the systems for better technology, marketing, things that they hadn't really thought of before because it didn't fall into sort of the operations capital buckets. You know, it's like, oh yeah, technology. And then all the systems continuing to struggle with marketing. So it's made a really big difference in literally how the agency is funding the transit systems now. And they've also been willing to put together a transit advisory committee, which has been great, so that they're getting more direct feedback from the transit systems when they say, okay, here's roughly how much money we think we're going to have. How do we come up with a rough budget for the next 4 years for how we're going to spend that money? I mean, that never used to happen. So it's been a really great change in terms of transparency and working with the systems to really figure out where are you trying to get to and what's the best use of the funds that we know will be coming in. So the other thing that I really wanted to focus on is how important it is to be working on communication. And again, that's a lot of what associations focus on. It's that communication piece to the public that's also really important. So whether it's having an updated website and having somebody to keep it updated, or having a Facebook account, a Twitter account, having a presence out there in the world. And also sometimes what we do is we also help systems with job openings. We post job openings for systems on our Facebook account. So all those kinds of things, trying to help the systems tell their story and communicate the value of transit is a lot of what we focus on. And I know in both states, I think folks have done a lot to really think about what are ways that we can find those really great stories, because that's what really moves people, whether it's the public or whether it's legislators or whether it's local officials. They want to hear those stories about the woman next door who needs kidney dialysis and doesn't have any other way to get there but through the local transit system, or the kids who go to daycare after school and their parents now don't have to leave work to take their kids to daycare because the local transit system can do it. All those kinds of stories, helping systems find ways to, whether it's video, taking photos, doing interviews, making sure you have informed consent, so you can use images and you can use people's stories, and then finding ways to get those out into the world. So we just think that that's really important. And of course, local news media, it's become more of a struggle, I think, but it's also another avenue. And sometimes we've set up meetings with editorial boards or certain reporters, or helped arrange for a reporter to literally go visit a transit system and ride on the bus, and you get these great news stories about, you know, what it's like to use the local transit system. So that's another avenue that associations can really help with. So these are just some of the stories. You know, and sometimes it's not just the riders, but also the staff, and letting them have a chance to tell their stories. Whether it's a driver who just loves being a driver, and maybe it's a volunteer driver who loves, you know, helping their neighbors get around. But being able to gather those kinds of stories, we found has been really powerful. This one, the font is kind of small, but anyway, it's just an example again of kind of highlighting a rider, telling his story, why he rides the bus, why it's important to him. And I always like pictures with kids, because again, you have to be able to convey the value of transit to a community. And so again, a lot of what we focus on is how do we tell the story? How do we be effective? And how can we help transit systems to tell their stories and do it in a way that's effective? So we've also used some new technology when it comes to mobilizing advocates. There are a lot of different platforms and things out there where you can use text messages to help people communicate with legislators instead of kind of the old-fashioned, everybody send the same email kind of thing, or trying to get people to handwrite letters. We've also looked at different applications where you can literally use text messages to get people on a certain day when a vote's coming up to all communicate with their legislators at the same time. So again, I think the bottom line is that associations really help with coalition building, with raising awareness, with developing a stronger voice, and with really being that advocate for you and your issues and your needs, whether it's with agencies, whether it's with the legislature, whether it's with members of Congress or local officials, or communicating with the public about, you know, here's why this system is so important. Here's how you use it. Here's how it works. All those kinds of nuts and bolts kinds of issues. And I think, you know, the bottom line is it's about your bottom line. So our goal is for you all to have more resources, more funding, And so your contribution, your membership dues, your events, payments, all of those kinds of things really pay off in the long run, because we are able to really be that voice to increase funding for transit and to make sure that systems are growing and expanding and reaching more of the community. So again, we're here to listen and be a resource, and we would love to get your feedback on what you think about your associations and what you want your association to do for you.
And if I just might add, with Wisconsin, we did this last year, going through a strategic plan. That was the whole purpose of that is, okay, how can we reach out to members and find out what it is they're looking for? And so we heard that, put together a strategic plan, and we're going to implement that. We have that as our guiding tool to implement different things that hopefully will be more useful for individual members. But we can only do that if members are participating and active. Wisconsin, I just remember when I first participated with our different association meetings, it was really, it was very informal, and everything's done by volunteers. And since then, we're trying to evolve and become, and grow into an association that will be able to provide procurement assistance, provide solution, best practice information available, those kinds of things. A lot of times what we see throughout Wisconsin is that we're emailing back and forth off of old email lists, so provide an updated email list that you have all the current transit managers and system operators and rural providers and so forth, depending upon the topic and where you're trying to get information from. And I think, I see that John's here. We also have vendors and we have a vendor representative that sits on our board. And we want to hear their perspective on things like when we're planning conferences. What is it you're looking for? How can this conference be valuable to you so that you would want to attend it every year and bring out good information that our members need? So every association is always trying to improve. I think we at least have in place something, a roadmap to use, listening from the members. And I know that there are people on my email list that don't necessarily pay dues, but still they're responsible for providing public transportation. So you want to make sure that they're up to date on what's happening in Madison, what might be important to them, and those things.
Yep. So we really do want to hear from you all. Your questions, your feedback. We don't have a whole lot of people online or participating remotely, but this is your chance to tell us what you think and what you would like to see your association do for you.
We're members of the private company. New York Association organizes combination of funding, money,
Yeah, that is a really great point. And I think it's probably something we could do more of. You know, sometimes there are companies that are a lot more interested in being active than others, but I think we all have vendor member reps, you know, that work with our associations to some extent. I know with New Flyer, that's been a big focus in Minnesota, where we've been able to literally bring legislators there and show them around and talk about the jobs and talk about the economic impact. And they've been really good about doing that. So I think that is, again, a really good point to try and do more of that, because I think that is, you know, it's important to talk about the economic impact, that there is an industry that, you know, provides jobs for people in the community. Sometimes companies kind of, some of the feedback we get is they feel sort of like it's a little, maybe it looks a little self-serving, or they're a little hesitant sometimes to be associated with a piece of legislation or a certain agenda. But I think in general, if we can get them to just kind of be general advocates, then that is a really good connection and a really good resource. Anything else? Do you feel like you get the information that you need? Because I know we try to keep people updated on what's going on. I know with COVID, there was a lot of back and forth about FTA rules and regulations changing all the time. And I know the FTA did a pretty good job of having the FAQs on their website, but we were, again, we kind of jumped into gear to some extent to kind of go, okay, we got to figure out what we need to tell people now, because everybody's wondering what's going on, what are the rules, you know, what level of service our system's able to provide, all the things about blocking off certain seats and the masks and the screens and the cleaning, all those kinds of things. You know, we definitely did a lot more frequent communication with our members and really tried to help them work through some of those things, including, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, people trying to find hand sanitizer. It was like toilet paper, you know, like nobody has any. So we like reached out to certain companies, and there were companies that used to make like liquor that suddenly decided to switch to making hand sanitizer. So all those kinds of things were definitely a challenge during the pandemic times early on. Not that we're out of it completely, but. So did you want to add anything else, Tom?
Just that it's been a valuable experience for me. Involved in I know that I get much more out of it. And, I think you find the same too. Is, you know, you want to serve on committees or you know, participate in you'll get a lot out of it.
And I also want to just put in a quick plug for the difference between lobbying and advocacy, because that's an issue that I know has come up in our state, where some of the systems were questioned about their payment of dues to the association because the association lobbies. And so we just want to make clear that there is a difference between direct lobbying for a particular piece of legislation and general advocacy. And a lot of what associations do is education and advocacy. There is a certain amount of lobbying we do because that's another value that we bring that, you know, you don't necessarily get on your own. But it is limited, and you can still pay dues to your association. And the only thing you have to be careful about is making sure that federal funds are not used for lobbying. Local funds, state funds, it's fine. It's only, there is a prohibition on using federal funds for lobbying. So I guess that's it. Thank you for being here. Thank you.